Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. The shockwave touched off by Eric's secret deal with Katie unfolds as one of the most destabilizing narratives the Forrester dynasty has ever faced, because at its core this plot isn't simply about a covert agreement or a temporary power struggle, but about the fragile armature of trust upon which the Forrester mansion, and the family itself has been erected for decades. And as the disclosure ripples outward, it leaves Brooke Logan and Ridge Forrester stunned, disoriented, and forced to defy the intimidating consummation that control, formerly assumed to be endless, is in fact envisioned maintained only so long as secrets remain buried, because Eric's shocking pact isn't a reckless impulse but a calculated initiative born of times of watching his son dominate opinions, connections, and the very soul of Forrester creations, and in choosing to entrust in Katie Logan, Eric signals a profound shift in fidelity and strategy that cuts deeper than any public treason ever could, as Katie, frequently undervalued, constantly sidelined, yet acutely observant, becomes the quiet axis around which the balance of power begins to cock, and the significance of this alliance is magnified by the setting itself, because the Forrester mansion has always represented stability, durability, and patriarchal authority, and the idea that its future could be jeopardized by an agreement forged behind unrestricted doors introduces a nearly Shakespearean pressure where home becomes battlefield and heritage becomes contributory damage, while Ridge's loss of control is portrayed not as an unforeseen collapse but as a slow, agonizing corrosion, a man habituated to commanding both boardrooms and hearts now seeing that opinions are being made without him, that exchanges stop when he enters the room, and that the familiar walls of the manse echo with secrets that count him. And this destabilization is farther boosted by Brooke's emotional edge point, because she has lived through numerous Forrester wars and understands more than anyone that when Eric moves still it's no way without purpose, and her shock is concentrated with fear that this time the consequences won't be confined to bruised self-esteem or broken loves but will rather permanently fracture the family structure, especially as Eric's provocations crop as heartbreakingly complex, embedded in a desire to cover the Forrester heritage from what he perceives as Ridge's decreasingly impulsive leadership, and in this sense the pact with Katie becomes both an act of rebellion and an act of preservation, an incongruity that energizes the drama because Eric isn't situating himself as a villain but as a guardian willing to make innocently nebulous choices for what he believes is the lesser good, and Katie's part in this cannot be exaggerated, because she embodies the moral Argentine zone of the plot, torn between fidelity to her family, concern for Brooke, and a growing mindfulness that Eric is entrusting her with information important enough to redraw the family scale, and as she absorbs the weight of this responsibility the narrative emphasizes her internal conflict, showing how the secret begins to insulate her indeed as it elevates her, transubstantiating her from a supplemental figure into a vital player whose silence or concession could determine whether the Forrester mansion remains a symbol of consanity or becomes a monument to treason, and Ridge's unraveling is rendered with particular pungency as his frustration morphs into paranoia, his confidence into guard, because the script precisely illustrates how control isn't only about authority but about being informed, and once Ridge realizes that he's no longer at the center of every strategic discussion his sense of identity begins to deteriorate, egging competitions that are charged with dubitation and emotional volatility, especially when directed at Brooke, whose attempts to soothe and reason are undercut by her own query about what Eric might be planning, and the pressure between Brooke and Ridge therefore becomes an exemplification of the larger family conflict, reflecting how secrets erode closeness and how power struggles seep into indeed the most continuing connections, while Eric's scenes, frequently quiet and reflective, discrepancy sprucely with the chaos he has unleashed, depicting a man completely apprehensive of the storm he's creating yet bent in his belief that occasionally destruction is necessary for renewal, and this philosophical peak between father and son elevates the plot beyond psychodrama into a contemplation on heritage, asking whether tradition should be saved at all costs or acclimated through radical change, and as whispers of the secret deal begin to circulate half-trueness, suspicious ganders, loaded pauses, the Forrester mansion itself seems to reply, its grand halls getting spaces of apprehension rather than comfort, buttressing the idea that a home erected on implied agreements can be just as fragile as any commercial conglomerate, and the brewing possibility that the deal could fairly or financially compromise the estate raises the stakes indeed higher, transubstantiating emotional fallout into palpable threat, And this is where the script truly excels, intertwining particular treason with institutional jeopardy so that every character's response carries both emotional and practical consequences. And as the shockwaves spread, alliances subtly shift, old grievances resurface, and long-suppressed resentments find new defense, suggesting that Eric's pact has not created disharmony so much as exposed fault lines that have was each on, and the bystander is left to grapple with the unsettling notion that Ridge's loss of control might be less a theft than a reckoning, a forced battle with the limits of his authority and the cost of taking fidelity for granted, while Brooke's fear reflects a deeper anxiety about history repeating itself, about watching the family she has fought to belong to formerly again buckle under the weight of pride and secretiveness, and Katie's silence becomes the most important element of all, because in a world defined by dramatic exposures and explosive competitions, the choice to withhold the verity becomes an act of immense narrative pressure, holding the followership in suspension as they await the ineluctable moment when the secret will surface and the full impact of Eric's decision will be felt, and until that moment arrives the story lingers in a state of charged expectation, where every discussion feels like a prelude to disaster and every gesture carries retired meaning, eventually presenting a plot that isn't just about a shocking pact or a loss of control but about the enduring question at the heart of the bold and the beautiful Weather family is defined by blood and heritage or by honesty and collective respect, and whether the Forrester dynasty can survive yet another storm born not of external adversaries but of the secrets they keep from one another. As the fate of Eric's covert arrangement with Katie continues to unfold, the narrative deepens into an intricate cerebral and emotional maze in which every character is forced to define not only the immediate counter-accusations of the pact but also the long-standing negotiations, implied resentments, and buried fears that have shaped their lives within the rout of the Forrester name. And this durability of the story designedly slows its pace to allow the consequences to transit into every corner of the menage, transubstantiating the Forrester mansion from a place of majesty and familiarity into a terrain charged with dubitation, where indeed the most mundane relations are invested with a sense of foreboding, because what Eric has set in stir isn't a single dramatic explosion but a prolonged destabilization that erodes certainty day by day, and as Brooke struggles to maintain emotional equilibrium she becomes decreasingly apprehensive that the silence girding Eric and Katie's agreement is more dangerous than any open battle, for silence allows imagination to flourish, and imagination within this family has always been able of turning abettors into adversaries, and Brooke's internal conflict intensifies as she weighs her spontaneous fidelity to Eric, a man who has frequently represented wisdom and tradition, against her devotion to Ridge, whose volatility and wounded pride now manifest in restless energy, sharp allegations, and a growing sense of treason that he cannot yet eloquent, and this pressure places Brooke in the familiar yet agonizing position of middleman, trying to hold together a family formerly slivering under the weight of its own history, while Ridge's cerebral descent becomes a central focus of the durability, portrayed not as melodramatic fever but as a slow-burning extremity of identity, because Ridge has always defined himself through control over his work, his romantic choices, and the direction of the family conglomerate, and the consummation that his father has maneuvered beyond his reach, entrusting critical opinions to Katie rather than to him, strikes at the core of his tone conception, leaving him oscillating between rage and tone mistrustfulness, and this internal fermentation manifests in competitions that are lower about uncovering the verity and further about reasserting dominance, yet each attempt only underscores how important authority he has formerly lost, creating a painful irony that the followership is invited to witness with both sympathy and apprehension, while Eric, observing these developments from a distance, remains outwardly composed yet inwardly burdened by the moral weight of his decision, and the durability grants him moments of soul-searching in which he reflects on the heritage he has erected, the son he has raised, and the painful necessity of choosing between domestic harmony and what he perceives as the long-term survival of everything the Forrester name represents. And these reflections reveal that Eric's pact with Katie isn't solely strategic but deeply particular, embedded in a fear of getting inapplicable within his own family and a determination to assert that wisdom accrued over decades still carries value in a world decreasingly driven by impulsive ambition, and Katie herself becomes the emotional fulcrum of the story as the durability explores the cost of holding such a secret, depicting her insulation as both cerebral and relational, because each commerce with Brooke is pigmented with guilt, each exchange with Ridge shadowed by the knowledge that she possesses information able of altering his line, and this burden transforms Katie's address, advancing her quiet intensity that contrasts with her usual openness, and the script precisely examines how power, when acquired suddenly, can feel less like commission and more like confinement, as Katie grapples with the ethical counter-accusations of her silence and the growing dubitation that Eric's plan may have consequences indeed he cannot completely control, and as days pass without disclosure the manse itself becomes a silent substantiation to the unraveling, its iconic spaces serving as backgrounds for tense exchanges and moments of solitary reflection, buttressing the emblematic notion that the house, much like the family, is erected upon foundations that bear constant conservation lest they crack under pressure, and the implicit trouble to the manse's power or fiscal security, suggested through veiled dialogue and legal undertones, elevates the plot from emotional drama to empirical extremity, because the loss of the manse would signify not simply a change of hearthstone but the dissolution of a participated history that has anchored the Forresters through innumerous paroxysms, and this brewing threat forces secondary characters to rethink their faithfulness, subtly shifting the social dynamics within the menage as whispers of Eric's intentions circulate in fractured form, creating an atmosphere where trust is provisional and every assurance is questioned, and Brooke's growing apprehension culminates in moments of private anguish where she confronts the possibility that love alone may no longer be sufficient to bridge the widening ocean between father and son, egging her to consider whether intervention might complicate the situation rather than resolve it, while Ridge's competitions grow decreasingly erratic, marked by emotional volatility that alienates those he seeks to control, illustrating how despair can erode the veritably authority it aims to restore, and these scenes emphasize a central theme of the durability that power exercised without empathy becomes tone-defeating, a assignment Ridge is slow to learn yet decreasingly unfit to avoid, and as the narrative progresses Eric's calm resoluteness begins to show subtle cracks, suggesting that indeed the mastermind of this bouleversement isn't vulnerable to mistrustfulness, and in rare moments of vulnerability he questions whether entrusting Katie with similar responsibility was an act of wisdom or an adoption of paternal duty, adding layers of woeful complexity to his character and precluding the plot from settling into simplistic moral binaries, and the pressure reaches a sustained top not through a single disclosure but through accretive emotional strain, as Brooke senses the imminent collapse of precisely maintained facades. And Katie's countenance becomes decreasingly fragile, intimating that the secret cannot remain retired indefinitely, and the followership is drawn into a prolonged state of expectation, apprehensive that when the verity eventually emerges it'll not arrive as a cathartic release but as a destabilizing force that reshapes connections irrevocably, and this durability therefore reinforces the idea that the true destruction hovered by Eric's pact isn't simply fiscal or legal but deeply relational, hanging to strike the emotional armature that has sustained the Forrester family through generations. And by extending the fallout rather than rushing to resolution the script honors the complexity of its characters, allowing observers to engage with the uncomfortable reality that indeed well-intentioned opinions can produce ruinous consequences when filtered through pride, fear, and undetermined history, and as the final moments of this durability loiter on the image of the manse standing silent against the weight of secrets it harbors, the story leaves its followership with an unsettling question rather than a definitive answer whether the Forresters are able of learning from this extremity or whether, formerly again, the patterns of control, secretiveness, and emotional collateral damage will prevail, icing that the shockwaves unleashed by Eric and Katie's covert deal will continue to resonate long after the verity is eventually spoken. As the pressure inside the walls of the Forrester mansion continues to cake, the story moves into an indeed more emotionally unpredictable phase, one where the quiet apprehension that formerly dallied in ganders and half-finished rulings begins to harden into commodity far more dangerous, because secrets in the world of the bold and the beautiful no way remain dormant ever, and the longer Eric's pact with Katie remains concealed, the more it mutates into a sharp force that venoms perception, reshapes provocations, and compels each character to act not from verity but from supposition. And this durability leans heavily into that cerebral deterioration, showing how query itself becomes the antagonist, especially for Ridge, whose internal struggle evolves from dubitation into a near-compulsive need to reclaim authority, not only over the family business and the manse but over the narrative of his own life, because Ridge has always believed that translucency and leadership were synonymous, and now, brazened with the humiliating reality that his father has designedly bypassed him, he begins to question whether his entire identity has been constructed on a false sense of indispensability, and this consummation manifests in decreasingly reckless jest. Competitions fueled less by sense than by wounded pride, and moments where his wrathfulness spills over into allegations that strain indeed the most flexible bonds, particularly with Brooke Logan, who finds herself formerly again standing at the center of a Forrester storm, sorrowfully apprehensive that no matter how precisely she chooses her words they will be filtered through Ridge's growing paranoia, and Brooke's bow in this durability becomes one of quiet despair rather than overt conflict, as she recognizes the familiar pattern unfolding before her, a pattern she has lived through numerous times where love becomes contributory damage in a battle for control, and yet this time feels different, heavier, because the trouble isn't simply emotional separation but the implicit loss of the home that symbolizes everything the family has endured and survived. And Brooke's fear is compounded by her intuitive sense that Eric's provocations, while maybe embedded in protection, may eventually be eyeless to the emotional desolation they're causing, placing her in the agonizing position of understanding both sides while being suitable to completely defend neither. While Ridge's relationship with his father deteriorates into an implied standoff, each man induced of his own righteousness, and the absence of honest dialogue between them becomes further telling than any argument, as Eric's calm, nearly distant address stands in stark discrepancy to Ridge's volatility, buttressing the generational peak at the heart of the plot, where wisdom clashes with ambition and tolerance is incorrect for manipulation, and Eric, though outwardly composed, is untouched by the consequences of his decision, and the durability grants him moments of solitary reflection in which he wanders the manse's halls, girdled by recollections of a life spent erecting not just a conglomerate but a family, and these moments reveal the depth of his internal conflict, because Eric understands that by choosing Katie as his confidant he has disintegrated the traditional scale of trust, and while he believes this dislocation is necessary to guard the future, he cannot ignore the eating fear that he may be negotiating a fracture too deep to ever completely heal. And it's within this emotional vacuum that Katie Logan continues to evolve into one of the most compelling numbers in the narrative, her silence now less a choice and further a burden she carries with visible strain, because the weight of Eric's secret begins to manifest physically and emotionally, in insomniac nights, detracted exchanges, and a growing sense of insulation that separates her indeed from those she loves most, and the durability emphasizes that Katie's power lies not in manipulation but in restraint, as every occasion to speak the verity becomes a moral crossroads, forcing her to weigh the immediate relief of honesty against the potentially disastrous fallout of exposure. And this internal battle renders her decreasingly withdrawn, a metamorphosis that doesn't go unnoticed by Brooke, whose concern deepens into dubitation, creating a subtle yet potent rift between the sisters that underscores how Eric's decision has ripple goods far beyond its original intent, and as whispers within the manse grow louder, fueled by fractured compliances and misinterpreted relations, the atmosphere becomes nearly claustrophobic, with the majesty of the estate serving as a cruel discrepancy to the emotional suffocation endured by its occupants, and the possibility that the manse itself could be fairly or financially compromised looms ever larger, introduced through guarded exchanges and portentous counter-accusations rather than unequivocal exposition. A narrative choice that heightens pressure by allowing fear to fill in the gaps left by query, and this brewing trouble forces characters to defy what the manse truly represents to them, whether it's simply property or a sacred depository of participated history, and these differing comprehensions further fracture the family, as some view the threat as inferior while others, like Eric, feel willing to go everything to correct what they perceive as a dangerous imbalance of power, and Ridge's response to this trouble is particularly telling, because rather than inspiring concinnity it exacerbates his sense of siege, pushing him to double down on control in ways that alienate those around him, illustrating how fear, when conducted through pride, becomes destructive rather than defensive, and Brooke, watching this metamorphosis, begins to grapple with the possibility that love alone may not be enough to save them this time, a consummation that marks a subtle but significant shift in her character, as stopgap gives way to conservative literalism, and the durability uses these emotional beats to support a central theme of the plot that heritage isn't saved through dominance but through rigidity and empathy, assignments that neither Eric nor Ridge feel completely able of embracing at this stage, and as the pressure mounts, Katie's countenance eventually begins to fracture, not through a dramatic concession but through small, mortal moments of vulnerability that elude at an impending collapse, moments where her eyes loiter too long on Brooke, where her voice falters when Ridge demands answers, and these moments serve as narrative forerunning, motioning that the secret is approaching a breaking point, and yet the durability resists the temptation of immediate disclosure, rather allowing the pressure to stretch, to breathe, to come nearly unsupportable, because in this world the fate of verity is always further consequential than the verity itself. And as the final passages of this durability settle into a dimmed stillness, the Forrester mansion stands formally again as a silent character in its own right, bearing substantiation to the slow unraveling of the family it harbors, and the followership is left with the unsettling understanding that Eric's shocking pact, far from being a contained initiative, has come a catalyst for metamorphosis that will irrevocably alter the emotional and structural foundation of the Forrester dynasty, raising the ineluctable question not of who'll win this power struggle, but of what will remain once the dust eventually settles, and whether the cost of control, formerly completely paid, will prove too high for indeed the most flexible of families to bear.